More people are living in slavery today than at any other time in history. Today is the World Day Against Human Trafficking, designed to raise awareness of the problem. It's one aspect of modern-day slavery. But the United Nations estimates more than 40 million people worldwide are trapped in some form of slavery. Women and girls make up around 70% of the victims. Many are exploited for sexual slavery. While the problem is said to be most prevalent in Africa and Asia, there's also an estimated 1.5 million slaves in the developed world. Police here in Germany recently made arrests linked to a suspected international smuggling ring. Although the vast majority of people who are trafficked are women and young girls, men are trafficked as well. We have this report from Pakistan about a man who was kidnapped and forced to work in quarries for years before escaping his captors. He's still coming to terms with the time he spent as a slave.
This television and video recorder are the only luxuries Mohammad Arif has. He lives in a small 9-square-meter simple hut in northern Pakistan. Arif once had a family and a job and was happy. But then as a young adult, he was kidnapped by 3 men. They put something over my head and I lost consciousness. When I regained my senses, I had no idea where I was. They brutalized me over and over again. I remember that to this day. They held him captive for more than 20 years. He worked up to 16 hours a day in a quarry like this one. Breaks were not allowed. Anyone who sat down was beaten by the guards. But he remembers that the nights were even worse than the days. At night, they would lock us up and put us in chains. They threw food at us that you wouldn't even give to dogs. It was barbaric. That's how I spent my life there, with no contact to the outside world. Arif was also unable to contact his wife, Shamim Bibi. She spent several years desperately trying to find her husband. Eventually, she gave up, thinking he was dead. And so she looked for a new husband. We searched everywhere for him, called all the hospitals, but at some point we had no strength left. It had been 10 years. The children were still small, and I needed someone to take care of them. According to UN figures, between 600 and 800,000 people are victims of trafficking every year. In Pakistan, officially documented cases have declined in recent years, but the crimes still continue to this day. In Pakistan, this happens mostly in remote areas, where there is hardly any infrastructure and a lack of education. The perpetrators then kidnap people and receive a reward. Most of the times, the victims are put to work. As fate would have it, Mohammad Arif is still hauling stones and manages to scrape by doing this work. At least he's no longer doing it as a slave laborer, because one morning he decided to jump off the boat that took him and the other men to work. I jumped into the water and started swimming. Then they shot at me, but I was lucky and they didn't hit me. For hours I kept swimming. At some point I dared to get out of the water. It was night, but I made it to the next village where they helped me. A few years ago, he came back to his home village of Haripur. He still suffers from the trauma of that time. To this day, he has not found a way to regain his life.
For more on this story, we can speak now to Siobhan Mullally in Galway, Ireland. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Trafficking. Welcome to DW. We just saw there in our report the incredible story of a survivor of human trafficking, but he does have a unique story. So what does usually end up happening to people who are trafficked?
Well, what happens can really vary. Your report just highlighted that some very few survivors do escape from their traffickers and may receive assistance from local communities, from service providers, from NGOs, police, or others. But many continue for years in situations of severe exploitation. In the context of sexual exploitation, they may be repeatedly raped, beaten, enclosed within apartments or houses, and forced into prostitution. Others, in the context of labour exploitation, are forced to work for years with little or no payments, and often subject to very severe physical abuse along with the labour exploitation. So it is a very serious human rights violation, and one that can continue over many years.
And the number of trafficking victims, especially children, has gone up in recent years, Siobhan. What impact has the pandemic had?
The pandemic has had a very serious impact, and this is a concern as we see children out of school, increasingly online, and therefore at risk of traffickers who work online, who seek to groom and identify children and recruit them into situations of armed conflict, labour exploitation, but also, of course, online sexual exploitation. And with the collapse of informal economies in many parts of the world, we see rising unemployment. We see migrant workers being returned home with nothing to support them. And children may become a key source of income. So we are also seeing and hearing reports of increases in child marriage. And this is a very serious concern. We also saw this in the context of the Ebola crisis in West Africa, where we saw increases in exploitation of children and women in particular, who tend to be concentrated in informal economies.
We tend to talk about trafficking in the context of developing countries, but it does also exist in the developing world. So what do you see there?
Trafficking can happen anywhere. So it may be in the construction sector, it may be in restaurants and tourism, it may be in the context of sexual exploitation. It's often hidden in plain sight. So it's all around us. And we see in particular workers being exploited in agriculture, in fruit picking, in vegetable picking, in the construction sector, and in the context of hospitality and restaurants. And not enough resources are going into labour inspectorates, to supporting trade unions, to supporting worker-led initiatives. A concern also is in the context of the pandemic that fewer victims are being identified. And this was reported also in the context of Pakistan. But this is happening everywhere as law enforcement resources are being diverted, as NGOs find it more difficult to operate. We're not seeing as many victims being identified and referred for protection.
If you could identify one priority, one measure that could be implemented to address human trafficking in the short term, what would that be?
I think we really need to see what is happening in supply chains in the context of labour exploitation, and in particular exploitation of children, where we see children being forced into labour exploitation in the context of cocoa plantations, tobacco plantations, high numbers of children being trafficked for the purpose of labour exploitation, particularly in the West African region, but generating huge profits for multinational corporations. And we really need to move beyond looking at voluntary compliance by the business sector, taking seriously what is happening and identifying victims of trafficking in their supply chains.
We will have to leave it there. Siobhan Mullally, UN's Special Rapporteur on Human Trafficking. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.